Welcome, colleagues, to this clinical masterclass focusing on Pinus sylvestris, the pine remedy. We have titled this lecture The Architecture of Worthiness because the capacity to receive love, joy, and the fruits of one's own labor is an internal psychological structure that must be built and maintained. In the batch remedy classification system, pine is positioned within group 6, covering the emotional terrain of despondency and despair. While neighboring remedies in this group address things like a lack of confidence or responses to external crises, pine targets a deeply internalized foundational flaw, the chronic guilt complex and systemic self-reproach. As clinicians, we often see individuals whose external reality is defined by high achievement, kindness, and deep responsibility, yet whose inner life is a harsh environment of self condemnation. Our core thematic focus today will examine how constant self blame and inability to accept personal success and a habit of absorbing the faults of others paralyze human expression. Our goal is to understand how this remedy facilitates a profound transition toward genuine humility and self forgiveness. Let us begin section 1 by mapping out the energetic architecture of the pine state. To understand this archetype, we must look at it as a predictable path of behavioral and emotional degradation. We start with a highly conscientious, deeply moral individual who possesses a strong sense of duty. However, when the negative pine matrix intervenes, a wave of irrational guilt is driven between their efforts and their self assessment. This guilt breeds immediate cognitive distortion. The individual looks at any imperfect situation and automatically says, "This is my fault." This self blame leads to an emotional pattern where the person feels they have no right to rest, enjoy success, or receive care. This cycle is self reinforcing. In this section, we will deconstruct this guilt complex, draw a definitive line between healthy responsibility and toxic self reproach, and analyze the hidden somatic and psychological costs of constant self punishment. When diagnosing the core pine state, you must train yourself to see an invisible psychological burden. Imagine a highly capable, hardworking individual walking through life carrying a massive weight that doesn't belong to them. They can perform an incredible job, pull off a major project, or keep an entire household running flawlessly. Yet they will completely ignore the success and fixate on a tiny flaw, blaming themselves for not doing better. The baseline reality of this slide is clear. Responsibility exists, but it is distorted. The patient is not irresponsible, they are overconscious. Satisfaction is entirely absent, meaning their own achievements are constantly undermined by a feeling that they should have done better. They assume blame as a historical fact before an event has even concluded. Even more striking, they take on the faults, mistakes, and misfortunes of others. If a coworker drops the ball, a pine person will think, "I should have anticipated that and helped them more." They live with a chronic guilt complex that saps the joy out of daily life. Let's trace the dynamic behavioral flowchart of the pine guilt loop. This is not a static state of mind, it's a degenerative process. The loop begins with an impossibly high internal standard of perfection and duty. When a person inevitably falls short of this standard, or when someone around them experiences a problem, their mind generates an immediate projection, self reproach. When a person internalizes blame with absolute certainty, their nervous system treats the perceived failure as a moral transgression, triggering a strategy of overcompensation and constant apologizing. By apologizing and working even harder, the individual achieves immediate short term relief from the anxiety of being inadequate. However, the long term clinical cost is devastating emotional exhaustion. Without self forgiveness, there is no emotional restoration. This lack of data reinforces the person's pre existing feeling of unworthiness, causing their internal climate to decline even further. As a practitioner, you must disrupt this loop because every time a patient accepts unearned blame, the pine state becomes more deeply entrenched. I refer to this condition as the silent tragedy of pine because it leaves no outward signs of malice, loud cries, or explosive aggression towards others. It's a quiet, eroding loss of self worth. If we look at two parallel life paths, we see the true cost. On one path, an individual experiences life, makes mistakes, extracts the lesson, and moves forward with a clear conscience. On the parallel path, the pine path, the individual turns every mistake into a permanent trial where they are simultaneously the accused, the judge, and the executioner. The greatest loss in human development here is the inability to receive joy. Their efforts remain entirely uncelebrated in their own minds. Opportunities for happiness pass by unused because they feel they do not deserve them. Over time, the boundaries of the individual's emotional life contract. Life becomes significantly smaller than their potential because they constantly working to pay off an imaginary moral debt. Self-condemnation completely replaces active growth, and the individual settles into a quiet, exhausting resignation, apologizing just for existing. What does the clinical resolution of this state look like? The transformation of mind is beautiful in its steady, unshakable restoration of peace. Think of a closed, tightly bound knot finally opening and allowing energy to flow freely. When Pine Remedy is introduced, it doesn't create a careless attitude or a lack of moral accountability. Instead, it births a healthy, grounded self forgiveness and true humility. The primary clinical indicator of improvement is the renewed capacity to accept one's own efforts. The patient stops apologizing constantly and begins saying, I did my best and that is enough. They re enter the school of life, understanding that mistakes are not moral failures demanding punishment, but simply experiences that teach us how to stumble less in the future. They experience complete freedom from the weight of unearned blame, leading to the gradual realization of their personal worthiness. We now enter section 2, Dr. Batch's original vision. To prescribe with high accuracy, we must strip away modern assumptions and look directly at how Dr. Edward Batch conceptualized this remedy in his original writings. Dr. Batch was a brilliant clinical observer who recognized that self condemnation was a core spiritual block that prevented the soul from fulfilling its earthly purpose. In this section, we will look at Bach's precise definitions, explore how he isolated the nature of self-reproach, and map out the crucial clinical boundary between fear, which belongs to other remedy categories, and pure guilt. Ultimately, we will look at what Bach considered a fundamental human truth, that condemning ourselves is actually a restriction on universal love. Let us read Dr. Bach's definitive text from the 12 Healers, which serves as our absolute diagnostic compass for this remedy. He wrote, "For those who blame themselves, even when successful, they think they could have done better and are never content with their decisions or the results." Let's pause on that phrase. This is the language of chronic dissatisfaction. It's an immediate, automatic discounting of one's best efforts. He continues, "They are hardworking and suffer much from the faults they attach to themselves." Note the phrase suffer much. This is an active internalized friction. Finally, he writes, even if there is a mistake made by another, they will claim the responsibility for it. This is the clinical endpoint, the absorption of external blame, which cleanly isolates the issue. The problem is not a lack of effort or success, it's the lack of permission to be at peace with that success. This quote reveals that Pine is specifically indicated when a patient surrenders their peace of mind to an ongoing trial of self blame. To simplify your clinical assessment, we can break the Pine archetype down into three pillars. Think of this as a diagnostic triad that must be present in your patient's intake presentation. Pillar 1 is self reproach. This is the constant, painful belief that one's achievements are fundamentally flawed and that one is always falling short of a moral or professional ideal. Pillar 2 is the absorption of blame. This manifests as an internal script that claims responsibility for the mistakes, negative moods, or failures of people around them. Pillar 3 is the inability to receive. This is the behavioral expression of the first two pillars, where the patient actively declines compliments, refuses help when exhausted, and feels intensely guilty when receiving care or rewards. If you see hard work and high standards, but the person easily celebrates their success and leave others' mistakes to themselves, it's not a pure pine state. The true pine state requires all three pillars, culminating in absolute internal self punishment. This slide cuts directly to the core clinical paradox of pine, the complete disconnect between objective reality and subjective perception. As clinicians, we must run a dual assessment on every patient. On the left side, we look at objective reality. We find an individual who is highly responsible, deeply caring, completely dedicated, and thoroughly supportive. They have done their duty and executed their task with high integrity. But when we look at the right side, their subjective perception, we see an entirely different reality. Their internal dialogue screams, "Not enough, you failed, you should have prevented that problem, it's your fault." They discount their genuine contributions as merely what was expected, while inflating minor mishaps or others' errors into proof of total personal failure. Your job as a practitioner is to recognize that pine is not a remedy for moral development. It's a remedy to repair a distorted self assessment mechanism that refuses healthy responsibility with toxic self blame. We now enter section 3, where we examine the botanical signature of Pinus sylvestris, the Scots pine. In flower remedy therapy, the doctrine of signatures provide deep insight into plants' therapeutic application. The way a plant grows, its relationship to the elements, and its structural characteristics directly mirror the psychological dynamics it balances in humans. The Scots pine is an extraordinary tree with a highly unique botanical profile. By studying its high vertical lines, its tendency to grow in poor acidic soils, the unique quality of its resin, and its relationship to light and shadow, we can unlock a deeper understanding of how this remedy builds psychological stability in patients who feel fundamentally weighted down by a sense of unworthiness. Let us look closely at the physical growth of the pine tree. Pinus sylvestris is known for its remarkable vertical drive, carrying its foliage high up into a leafy canopy, leaving its lower trunk bare. It relentlessly pushes past the shadows of the forest floor to claim its natural right to light and air. This high canopy represents a powerful botanical signature of high ideals and aspiration. However, when inverted in the negative human archetype, this extreme upward focus causes the individual to completely lose touch with their grounded earthly nature, setting standards so high that they live in a permanent shadow of self perceived failure. For a patient stuck in a collapsed, self reproaching pine state, someone who hides their head and lives in a shadow of guilt, this botanical energy introduces the structural frequency of balance, helping them reconcile their high ideals with their human reality. The most unique physiological feature of the pine tree is its rich aromatic resin production. When the bark of pine is wounded or broken, it does not rot or wither. It immediately secretes a thick golden resin that seals the wound, protects the tree from infection, and purifies the damaged tissue, allowing the wood to heal beautifully. This behavior is a profound psychological metaphor. It represents the capacity to heal emotional wounds, to let go of past failures, and to wash away the sticky, toxic accumulation of old guilt. The pine tree does not let its wounds fester into decay. It utilizes its resin to cleanse and seal the past. This teaches the patient that true worthiness includes the willingness to release defense armoring, stop punishing oneself for old wounds, and allow the flow of self forgiveness to cleanse their internal climate. We must also consider where Pinus sylvestris chooses to live. It thrives in remarkably poor acidic and sandy soils where other trees cannot survive. It does not require a rich, deeply fertilized, or sheltered valley to achieve its massive height and structural strength. This habitat tells us that pine possesses immense intrinsic resilience and perseverance. It can build a magnificent towering structure out of minimal external nourishment. However, in the human emotional matrix, this signature reflects a person who works tirelessly while denying themselves the emotional nourishment, praise, and care they deserve. Pine infuses the human personality with a balanced understanding of this strength, enabling them to stand firm while learning to gracefully accept the nourishment and joy that life offers them. Unlike deciduous trees that completely shed their leaves in winter, the pine holds its needles throughout the harshest cold, maintaining its green vitality year round. It carries its needles through multiple seasons, showing a steady endurance against the shifting elements. This evergreen nature represents unmitigated perseverance and endurance. But when this energy is distorted by negative pine, the individual carries their past emotional burdens, old mistakes, and long dead guilts across multiple seasons of life, refusing to let them drop. The pine remedy works directly on this pattern, helping the patient understand that while their vitality and endurance are permanent, they do not need to use that strength to indefinitely carry the old cold weight of past errors. Let us integrate these botanical observations into a clear clinical map. When we look at Pinus sylvestris, we are looking at the literal embodiment of structural endurance and purification. Every physical feature corresponds directly to a psychological theme in our patients. Its lofty canopy addresses an overfixation on unattainable perfection. Its purifying resin cleanses chronic guilt and the sticky accumulation of unearned blame. Its survival in poor acidic soils balances the habit of denying oneself emotional nourishment, while its evergreen needles stabilize their unmitigated perseverance, redirecting it away from self punishment and toward constructive growth. By understanding this synthesis, you can see how the energy of this plant works to restructure the collapsed human ego, clearing away fog of self condemnation to reveal a grounded sense of worthiness. We now move into section 4, psychological and developmental expression. A pine state does not drop out of the sky into an adult's life. It's a pattern that develops over time, often tracing its roots back to early childhood and family dynamics where love was conditional or blame was easily assigned. To treat this condition effectively, we must understand how irrational guilt evolves across a lifespan. In this section, we will look at how the pine matrix manifests during distinct developmental stages. From the overly apologetic child in the primary classroom through the highly self critical adolescent internalizing family stress to the young adult experiencing a delayed launch due to a feeling of unworthiness, and finally to the adult stuck in a chronic pattern of self punishment. Understanding this timeline allows for early clinical intervention. In pediatric practice or family counseling, the child requiring pine presents a very specific behavioral profile. This is the overly apologetic child. When you observe them in a group setting, they consistently step forward to apologize whenever a game goes wrong or a toy is broken, even if they were on the other side of the room. They say sorry as a baseline reflex for simply occupying space. This behavior is driven by an early fear of falling short of parental expectations and an automatic habit of internalizing blame. They say things like, I should have been better, or it's my fault, mommy. It's sad. This is the critical window where early guilt formations take root. If left untreated, this early pattern hardens into a foundational belief system that dictates how they interact with responsibility for the rest of their lives, creating a permanent inner critique. As a child enters their formal school years, the Pine State manifests as the self discounting achiever. Teachers often write on their report cards, excellent student, highly responsible, but far too hard on themselves. This student frequently earns an outstanding grade on an assignment, but instead of celebrating, they will focus entirely on a single point deduction, visibly distressed by their perceived failure. They actively discount praise, claiming that the test was simply easy or that they got lucky. They sit quietly, paralyzed by the conviction that their work is never genuinely good enough to merit approval. This dynamic shows that irrational guilt actively restricts emotional fulfillment. The child's mind and work are fully functional, but their self reproach functions as an artificial ceiling, keeping them from experiencing any joy or satisfaction from their actual academic or artistic success. When a pine individual hits adolescence, the developmental pressure of identity formation amplifies their suffering, particularly within the family system. If there is marital tension, financial strain, or illness in the home, the pine adolescent automatically convinces themselves that they are the hidden cause of the family's unhappiness. This mindset leads to a severe pattern of self sacrifice. They avoid asking for new clothes, pass up school trips, and withdraw their own needs out of a profound fear of being a burden to their parents. They create a protective shell of over responsibility, trying to fix everyone's problems. They convince themselves that by carrying the family's stress, they are keeping the peace. But the true consequence is a deep, quiet isolation and a growing habit of ignoring their own developmental needs. In young adulthood, the pine state manifests behaviorally as the burden of unworthiness. This is a critical clinical presentation. These individuals graduate with excellent credentials, but completely freeze when it comes to accepting promotions or entering healthy relationships. They stand at a crossroads looking at paths ahead, but remain paralyzed by feeling that they don't deserve success or happiness. They consistently avoid leadership roles that offer higher pay, turn down advanced projects, and stay in positions far below their capability because they feel guilty taking rewards that could go to others. If an opportunity for major advancement appears, they step back and say, someone else deserves this more than me. This delayed ambition restricts their early life expansion, keeping them stuck in a cycle of self denial long after they possess the objective maturity to step into the world. If the pine state remains untreated into mature adulthood, it hardens into a chronic pattern of self punishment and overwork. This is the employee who has volunteered for every late shift and taken on everyone else's unfinished tasks for 20 years, quietly enduring the extra load without ever asking for a raise or recognition. They do not lack capability, they lack a sense of entitlement to fair treatment. This state is defined by chronic self limitation driven by guilt. They have completely habituated their self reproach, stopping any attempt to seek personal comfort or creative exposure. Their unique life remains entirely heavy. They rationalize their position by claiming that they are simply doing their duty. But deep down, a persistent guilt complex eats away at their self worth. Life becomes comfortably safe for everyone around them, but profoundly heavy and unfulfilled for the pine adult. Let us summarize the developmental journey of untreated pine state. It operates as a continuous compounding trajectory of self restriction. The childhood apology leads directly to adolescent internalization of family stress. The adolescent self sacrifice creates the foundation for adult underliving and overworking, resulting in a life defined by unearned blame and missed joy. However, the core clinical message of this timeline is optimism. Worthiness can be restored at any point along this pathway. When pine is introduced, whether to an 8-year-old child or a 60-year-old adult, it breaks this linear chain of self punishment. By initiating a self forgiveness, it unlocks the capacity to receive care and happiness, which completely rewrites their life narrative and allows the individual to step out from under the shadow of guilt. Now, we enter section 5, somatic markers and biological expression. As holistic clinicians, we know that the mind and body are not separate systems. Chronic emotional guilt is not just a collection of thoughts, it's a physiological state that leaves clear physical signatures in the organism. When an individual spends years blaming themselves and avoiding self care, their nervous system, musculature, immune function, and posture adapt to that state of chronic contraction and overwork. In this section, we will explore the somatic cost of self reproach, analyzing how it manifests as physical exhaustion from over efforting, the specific sick role paradox, chronic holding patterns in the core body, and a profound secondary fatigue that arises from constant emotional self punishment. Let us analyze the somatic presentation of pine. Physical exhaustion driven by sympathetic over efforting. Because a pine individual feels their work is never quite good enough to justify rest, they drive their body relentlessly. Their nervous system stays locked in an active state of high alert duty, running a continuous background program of performance anxiety. This manifests as long term physical strain. These individuals present with advanced systemic exhaustion, yet they override their body's clear signals for rest with pure mental willpower and an internal script of obligation. They carry a baseline of inner restlessness, driven by the feeling that sitting down or relaxing is an act of laziness or failure. Pine works beautifully here to lower this neurological drivenness, allowing the body to finally drop its defensive armor and enter a genuine state of physiological rest. A highly specific clinical variation of this physical strain is what I call the sick role paradox. When a pine patient's body inevitably collapses under the weight of continuous overwork and falls ill, they do not experience it as a normal physical alert. Instead, they fall into deep despondency and intense guilt because they are sick. They feel profoundly ashamed for staying home, worrying endlessly that their absence is overloading their colleagues or disrupting their family's routine. This mental stress actively delays their physical recovery, creating a secondary loop where the anxiety of being ill further suppresses immune function and deepens their exhaustion. Pine acts as a vital psychological stabilizer here, clearing the self blame and giving the patient full emotional permission to heal without guilt. When irrational guilt is chronic, it shifts from acute mental anxiety into permanent muscular holding patterns. If you examine a classic pine patient on the treatment table, you will see a physical reflection of psychological weight. They look as though they are literally carrying a heavy load on their back. The primary stress zones are concentrated in the upper trapezius, the rhomboids, and the lower back and the diaphragm. These individuals present with rounded, heavily weighted shoulders as if bracing themselves under a physical burden. They carry immense tension in the chest and engage in shallow, restricted diaphragmatic breathing, literally holding their breath out of an unconscious desire to minimize their presence and take up less space. By resolving the underlying self reproach, Pine helps release these deep neuromuscular patterns, allowing the chest to open and the body to stand relaxed. An overlooked somatic symptom of the pine state is a specific type of chronic fatigue. This is not a primary metabolic deficit, it's an emotional energy drain that occurs secondary to continuous self punishment and self denial. The process flow is clear. Managing a persistent guilt complex and maintaining an active inner critic requires immense psychic energy. When a person systematically denies themselves joy, fun, and rest, they experience a drop in positive vital motivation. This lack of emotional nourishment causes a profound loss of inner drive, leading to mental exhaustion and physical lethargy. The patient complains of feeling constantly heavy and tired, but their fatigue is actually a result of emotional self stagnation. Pine reignites their vital energy, and as they begin to accept self forgiveness and allow joy back to their life, this heavy secondary fatigue completely lifts. Let us synthesize our somatic findings into a fast clinical checklist. When a patient presents in your office, look for this specific combination of physical and psychological indicators. Physical exhaustion from clear overwork, acute guilt or shame when they feel ill, chronic muscular tension across the upper back and shoulders, as if carrying a heavy load, and a habit of discounting their own health needs. The ultimate diagnostic key is always the same. Their level of self blame far exceeds any actual error, and they express intense guilt for simply resting or being sick. If you see a highly responsible, hardworking body and mind locked in a state of physical contraction and functional self denial, your diagnostic focus should point directly to pine. Resolving this state will unblock both their physical vitality and their emotional freedom. We now enter section 6, clinical case files from practice. Abstract theory is valuable, but true clinical mastery is forged by observing how a remedy works in real world scenarios. In this section, we will analyze 5 distinct and detailed case files. These cases span different age groups, professions, and life situations, demonstrating how a hidden guilt complex disguises itself as other conditions such as extreme over-efforting, despondency, or chronic physical strain. We will trace the exact presentation of each patient and observe the step-by-step clinical and physical transformation that occurs once spine is introduced in their protocol. Our first case file concerns a 45 years old woman, an operational manager at a demanding firm. She possessed an incredible work ethic, but she drove herself directly into absolute physical exhaustion. She presented clinically with severe internal organ sagging, profound fatigue, and intense abdominal discomfort. However, her primary psychological distress was a crushing sense of guilt. She felt deeply ashamed that her physical illness forced her to stay away from the office, worrying constantly that she was letting her team down and overloading her colleagues. This is classical pine. High responsibility, physical strain, and absolute self blame for being sick. Prescription of combination of pine to address the guilt, gorse to clear her hopelessness, and olive to restore her drained physical energy. Within 3 months, her physical discomfort and organ sagging resolved completely. Her vitality returned, and she openly admitted how foolish she had been to punish herself with constant blame. Case number 2 focuses on engineer, a widowed mother whose grown son had recently decided to move across the ocean to build a new life in the United States. Instead of feeling proud or happy for his independence, she fell into deep despondency and ceaseless self reproach. She genuinely believed that her son's departure was proof that she had failed as a parent and failed to make his home life happy enough to stay. This acute emotional stress manifested physically as a persistent, highly unpleasant physical condition. This represents a chronic internalization of a natural life transition as a personal moral failure. After taking pine along with crabapple to address the physical symptoms, her physical condition cleared rapidly. More importantly, she experienced a total shift in perspective, releasing the unearned blame and finally feeling unmitigated, genuine joy for her son's new adventure. Case number 3, male patient of 38 years, team lead at a software engineering firm. He was highly respected, but he was trapped in a state of endless overwork and anxiety. Whenever a member of his team missed a deadline, made a coding error, or delivered a flawed project, he would lock himself in his office and absorb the entire blame, stating flatly to executives, "This is my failure. I should have managed them better." He was working 80 hours a week trying to personally correct every mistake made by his staff, leaving him on the brink of burnout. This case shows how perfectionism and a guilt complex can act as a sophisticated defense mechanism that harms a leader. Patient was using endless overwork to appease his inner critic. Treating him with pine dissolved his boundary distortion, enabling him to step back, hold his team members healthily accountable for their own work, and manage with quiet composure. Case number 4, a case of a female 31 years old classical pianist. She was exceptionally talented and had just won a prestigious regional competition. However, instead of celebrating, she spent her intake session expressing deep discomfort and guilt. Her core belief was a painful statement of unworthiness. The second place pianist practiced just as hard. "I feel terrible that I took the trophy away from her. I must have just gotten lucky and now she is hurting." This internal guilt ruined her enjoyment of her achievement and caused her to decline subsequent concert invitations because she felt she didn't deserve the spotlight. Somatically, she suffered from tight, restricted breathing and a heavy feeling in her chest whenever she performed. Pine was introduced to unlock her capacity to receive. Over several weeks, the heavy feeling in her chest disappeared. She released the false guilt over her victory, and she found the peace to accept her talent, embarking on a successful concert tour. Case number 5, 52 years old male patient, primary caregiver for his aging father. He performed his duties with immense love and care, but he was running on empty. Whenever a friend offered to step in for an afternoon so he could take a break, or whenever he considered hiring a part time nurse, he would completely freeze up with guilt. His self-assessment was completely skewed by self-reproach. He is my father. It is my absolute duty to care for him every single hour. If I take a break to go to the cinema or sleep, I am being entirely selfish. He was completely avoiding self care out of an expectation of moral failure. Treatment with Pine focused on bridging the gap between his love for his father and his love for himself. Within a few months, he successfully arranged for professional part time assistance, allowing him to rest without guilt and ultimately making him a more vibrant, present caregiver. Let us analyze the core clinical lessons from the five diverse case histories. When we strip away the individual details, we see that a single pattern links them all together. First, high competitive and deep responsibility were fully present in every single case. All five were deeply dedicated, hard-working individuals. Self-forgiveness and worthiness were the missing variables. Second, internal self-exclusion from joy was their shared behavioral pattern. They did not get punished by the world. They punished themselves before the world even had a chance to support them. This constant self blame reinforced their feeling of exhaustion. The most important lesson for us as practitioners is that self forgiveness is what initiated their physical and emotional transformation. Peace did not drop out of the sky. The Pine Remedy provided the emotional space to let go of the unearned blame, and real vitality grew through the resulting experience. We now enter section 7, differential diagnosis and matrix separation. In clinical practice, high accuracy prescribing requires master level differentiation. Many remedies present with surface similarities, such as withdrawal, fatigue, or high internal standards, but their underlying root mechanisms are completely different. If you prescribe pine to a patient whose overwork is driven by a simple lack of confidence or a fear of an external crisis, the remedy will fail. To ensure precision, we must isolate pine from five closely related remedies: larch, willow, rockwater, centauri, and elm. We will also examine its integration with the classic homeopathic constitutional remedy, Staphylos agria. Let us differentiate pine from larch using our previous module's archetype as a reference. Both remedies sit within the realm of self-diminishment, but their core focus is completely distinct. Larch is entirely capability based. The larch patient avoids a task because they doubt their talent, feel inferior to others, and expect personal failure. Their internal script is I cannot do it because I lack the ability. Pine, on the other hand, operates in the moral and existential realm of worthiness. The Pine patients does not necessarily doubt their ability. They are often highly capable and hardworking. However, they doubt their right to be happy, successful, or free of blame. They live in a state of chronic self-reproach, apologizing for their existence. Their internal script is I am not worthy of success. Everything is my fault. Larch asks, am I capable? Pine asks, am I clean? The distinction between pine and willow represents opposite ends of the blame spectrum. When things go wrong, we must evaluate where the individual directs the vector of responsibility. The pine individual directs all blame entirely inward. They take the faults of others onto their own shoulders, apologizing constantly and sinking into self reproach. Their internal climate is a harsh trial against themselves. The willow individual conversely projects all blame entirely outward. When they experience a failure or setback, they refuse to take any personal responsibility, choosing instead to blame their loss. their family, or fate itself. They sink into a toxic swamp of bitterness, resentment, and self pity, believing the world is treating them unfairly. Pine punishes themselves, willow punishes everyone else. Let us compare pine and rock water through the lens of perfectionism. Both types set impossibly high internal standards and are incredibly hard on themselves. But their underlying motivation is entirely different. The rockwater individual is driven by spiritual pride and an intense desire for self mastery. They want to be an exemplary model of discipline, and they actually enjoy the rigid separation of their desires. Their script is I must be perfect to achieve my high spiritual or physical ideals. The pine individual, however, is driven entirely by guilt and a fear of letting others down. They do not experience pride in their discipline. They experience an ongoing anxiety that they are never doing enough to justify their space on earth. They do not want to be an ideal model for others. They are simply trying to escape the agonizing bite of their own inner critic. Rock water acts out of pride, pine acts out of a guilt complex. Let us analyze the boundary between Pine and Centauri in relationships, as both can present with a pattern of subservience and overworking for others. The Centauri individual gives up their own needs because they possess a weak, easily influenced will. They are natural people pleasers who cannot say no because they have a passive desire for approval and fear rejection. Their script is I will do whatever you want because I want you to like me. The pine individual, by contrast, has a very strong will and immense endurance, but they serve others out of a deep feeling of moral obligation and unearned guilt. They say yes to extra burdens not because they are weak willed, but because their inner critic tells them that refusing to help is a selfish act that makes them a bad person. Centauri serves out of a need for connection. Pine serves out of a need to pay off an internal moral debt. Our final botanical comparison separates pine from elm along the timeline of responsibility. Both individuals can present with a profound sense of exhaustion under a heavy workload. However, elm is a temporary state of situational overwhelm. The elm individual is typically a highly confident, capable leader who loves responsibility. A moment comes where the sheer volume of tasks temporarily exceeds human capacity, causing them to freeze and feel momentarily inadequate. Pine, conversely, is a chronic structural personality pattern. The pine individual does not just feel overwhelmed by a sudden spike in responsibility, they actively go looking for extra burdens to take on, systematically underestimating their right to rest. Their fatigue is not a temporary crisis of capacity, but a long standing self imposed pattern of self punishment. Elm says, I have taken on too much and I am overwhelmed. Pine says, I must take on more or I am a failure. For those who practicing integrated holistic medicine, the energetic connection between the batch remedy pine and the homeopathic constitutional remedy staphysagria is profound. They form what I call a shared therapeutic axis of internalized emotional pressure. Both archetypes present with a history of suppressed emotions, a deep sensitivity to perceived moral failures, and a baseline of hidden self condemnation. The staphysagria patient often carries deep seated mortification, suppressed anger, and a history of accepting poor treatment because they feel on some deep level that they do not deserve better. They internalize emotional stress until it manifests as physical symptoms. When you find a patient who fits the constitutional profile of Staphylococcus aureus, adding pine to their flower remedy bottle creates an incredible synergy. It reinforces their internal boundary lines, releases the sticky web of historical guilt, and builds an unshakable foundation of personal worthiness. Let us review several advanced prescribing pearls to elevate your clinical accuracy with the Pine remedy. First, train your ear to listen for the language of constant apology during your case intake. Pay attention when a patient uses the word sorry or my fault as a conventional tick for completely neutral events. Second, look closely at how they react when they fall ill. If a patient presents with clear physical exhaustion but expresses intense anxiety or shame about missing work, think of pine immediately. Third, watch for subtle self-sabotage pattern where a patient hits a major success and immediately follows it with a period of intense overwork or a sudden downplaying of their achievement. Remember this vital clinical progression. The permission to rest often improves before the physical symptoms do. The remedy works by changing how the patient views their right to occupy space, allowing them to drop their burdens and heal cleanly. Let us look at three professional clinical formulations featuring pine designed for specific real world challenges. Formula 1 is the burnout recovery protocol, pine, olive, and gorse. This combination is specifically engineered for patients like first case file who have driven themselves into total physical collapse and need to balance chronic self-blame, deep cellular exhaustion, and the despondency of long-term illness. Formula 2, the true humility formula, pine, willow, and rock water. This is an incredible combination for balancing the entire blame spectrum within an individual, helping a patient who oscillates between harsh self-reproach, moments of bitter projection onto others, and a rigid, prideful perfectionism. Formula 3 is the boundary and worthiness formula. Pine, Centaurian, Walnut. This is ideal for codependent dynamics, chronic people pleasing, or major family transitions, helping the patient overcome irrational guilt, build a strong personal will to say no, and adapt to their new role without absorbing the emotional baggage of those around them. As we approach to the conclusion of this master class, let us elevate our perspective to look at the spiritual evolution of Pine archetype. At its highest energetic level, Pine facilitates a beautiful journey from the prison of self-condemnation to complete self-realization and grace. It helps the soul realize that it's a beautiful intrinsic part of the fabric of creation. When the pine energy is fully integrated, the habit of measuring one's right to exist through endless overwork completely dissolves. The individual understands that they do not need to earn love or pay a moral debt to justify taking up space on earth. They realize that true humility is not about beating oneself down, but about a deep, loving self expectation that frees them to serve the world out of joy rather than a heavy sense of guilt. They begin to participate fully and authentically in life, wrapped in a blanket of unshakable self forgiveness. In conclusion, let us reinforce the foundational principles of today's masterclass on Pine. Always remember, high consciousness is a gift, but when it twists into unearned guilt, it becomes a structural trap that drains the vitality of both mind and body. Your patients do not need to work harder. They need to repair their self assessment mechanism and allow themselves to receive care. Remember that self reproach is a restrictive script that shrinks human joy, and that self forgiveness is the only path that creates lasting health. Mastering the differential diagnosis between pine, larch, willow, and elm will immediately enhance your clinical accuracy. I challenge each of you to take these insights back to your practices. Watch for hidden pine states, especially in your chronically exhausted, overly apologetic patients, and help them drop the burdens that don't belong to them. Thank you for your presence today, and let us continue to explore together. Thank you.